All right, so we're back in the Middle East, and it looks complicated, and it looks complicated because it is complicated. So I thought I'd start here with this very fancy map, which I think is actually pretty cool, showing the different ethnic groups in the Middle East, or some of them, the major ones, and you can begin to get a sense of how messy things are. So Middle East, I think a lot of people think of Arab people, and you see there the yellow in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. These are all Arabs. But it's not just Arabs. Up here in the north, we have Turks who are green. Iranians are not Arabs. They are a different ethnic linguistic group. If you want to get somebody upset, tell an Iranian that they're an Arab. They'll get grumpy, and rightfully so. Sometimes people use the word Persians to describe Iranians. Iranians are Persians, but they are not ethnically or linguistically Arabs. Though Farsi, the language of Iran, has actually borrowed a lot of words from Arabic, it's not an Arabic language. Actually, Farsi, the Iranian language, is a Indo-European language, so it's distantly related to like French and German, very, very distantly. So Arabs, Turks, Persians, and then you have this sort of burgundy color here, which is the Kurds, uh, Kurds. The Kurds are another ethnic group, another ethnic linguistic group. They have their own history. All these peoples are almost entirely Muslim. There are some Arab Christians, but most Arabs are Muslim. Uh, but the Kurds, unlike these other groups, have never gotten a country. So the Turks have Turkey, the Arabs have various countries from Iraq to Syria to Saudi Arabia. The Iranians, of course, have Iran. The Jews over here have Israel, and the Kurds have nothing. They have little pieces of countries. And so different Kurdish groups have tried to get countries from time to time, which makes life difficult for the people who don't want them to get countries. I mean, think of it this way. If the Kurds got to be a country, Turkey would lose a chunk of territory. Iraq would lose a chunk of territory. Syria would lose a chunk of territory. Iran would lose a chunk of territory. None of them want to lose any territory. So all of them oppose the Kurds getting to be their own country, which can make the Kurds just a little bit grumpy. All right, so that's sort of a stepping back for a big picture of the Middle East. Now let's move in and start talking about the Iraq War. Now, we were talking about 9/11 and how that led to the United States invading Afghanistan. Again, to look back here, here's Afghanistan. And why did the United States invade Afghanistan? Well, because that's where Al Qaeda ended up being based. Remember, Al Qaeda is that group by Osama bin Laden. It's moved around a little bit. It's a terrorist group or a group of freedom fighters, depending on your point of view. But they ended up in Afghanistan. That's where they planned their attacks. And so that's where the United States attacked after September 11th. They attacked Afghanistan. But now we get Iraq. And that ends up being a problem. You see here a picture of President Bush. This is after the Iraq invasion. He's at an American aircraft carrier, actually the USS Abraham Lincoln, and he's making a speech. You see the sign above him, it says mission accomplished. Like, hey, we won this war. Only the war did not actually go that well. I mean, at this point, at this moment, when he's making this speech, it seems like the United States has won, whatever that means. But actually, the war is going to go on and on and on and on, and it's still going on to a degree to this day. So, mission accomplished? Well, in the end, Saddam Hussein was defeated while Bush was president. He was captured, he was put on trial, he was executed in 2006. Osama bin Laden actually was not captured until after Bush was no longer president. He was captured under President Obama, and he was killed in 2011. And yet those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere kept on going. So we're going to talk about that. Now, this Iraq war, why? Because the Afghanistan war kind of makes sense. I'm not a big fan of war. I don't think most people are. But the Afghanistan war, at least you can say, okay, Afghanistan didn't attack the United States, but Al Qaeda did. Osama bin Laden and his guys, and they were hanging out inside Afghanistan. So even though technically Afghanistan didn't do it, they were allowing people who did do it to be in their country. So the United States attacked and got rid of that government. They failed to catch bin Laden, but at least the Afghanistan attack makes sense. The Iraq attack, that's another story. So basically, and I'll talk more about this in class, but there's different reasons given for the Iraq War. The main official reason, the reason that the United States gave to the United Nations and that Bush gave to the American people, was WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. The United States government claimed that Iraq was busy building nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Very nasty things. And so Bush made statements like, facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. This is 2002. January 2003, he says the British have found uranium in Africa. And in March 2003, the United States invades Iraq. Now, by the way, this was the reason given, but it turned out to not be true. There were no WMDs in Iraq. This was false. Did the Bush administration make a mistake? Well, they had sources. They had evidence. But the problem is their sources were lying, and their evidence wasn't very good. Why would their sources lie? Well, a lot of the sources were Iraqis, citizens of Iraq, who hated their own government, which is very reasonable. Iraq was run by a really nasty man. We've talked about him before, Saddam Hussein. He was a bad man. He was an evil man. And a lot of Iraqis wanted him gone. So Iraqi exiles, Iraqis who had fled Iraq, came to the United States and said, hey, help us out. Help us get rid of this guy. And America wasn't really listening. So then these exiles started to say, hey, help us out. We know he has weapons of mass destruction. We can prove he's working on nukes. This was all not true. But at that point, America wanted to believe it. 9/11 had happened, and America was looking for targets. So weapons of mass destruction, that was the allegation, but in the end there was no evidence. And we know this because eventually the United States did invade Iraq, and they didn't find anything because there was nothing there. So that was the given reason. What else was there besides this? Because I say given reason like there's others. Well, there's this. A lot of people who discuss the Iraq War basically make the case that the Bush administration tried to get Americans to think there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. Now, let me be very clear. There was no connection. Iraq had nothing to do with the attacks on September 11th. That is a fact, as factual as you can get. However, as this little note down here says, almost 7 in 10, about 65% of Americans thought that Saddam Hussein was involved. Why would they think that? Well, a number of historians and journalists believe, and I have to say I think it's, I'm convinced, I think it's true, that the Bush administration basically tried to make them think that. In speech after speech, Bush, you see this little chart here, he would mention terrorism again and again, and then he stopped mentioning Osama bin Laden, and he started talking about Saddam Hussein. If you keep saying Saddam Hussein and terrorism, Saddam Hussein and terrorism, again and again in speech after speech, even if you don't specifically say Saddam Hussein planned 9/11, people might get that idea in their heads. And that seems to be what happened. This note here says from September 2002 to May 2003, 13 speeches given the period, 12 mentioned terror and Iraq in the same paragraph. 10 placed them within the same sentence. So if you put Iraq and terror in the same sentence, people are going to make a connection, even if you don't specifically say Iraq caused 9/11. You're going to give people that impression. Right here, when Bush says, Iraq's government openly praised the attacks of September the 11th. Now, did he say Iraq caused September 11th? No. But if you're not really paying attention, you're watching TV, the kids are yelling, you're doing the dishes, and you just hear Iraq 9/11, and you hear that again and again and again, well, people are impressionable. So the given reason for the Iraq War was weapons of mass destruction. I think the implied reason was it was somehow revenge for 9/11, even though there was no connection. But I think the Bush administration, and I'm not alone in thinking this, this is not a very, this is not a far out there theory. A lot of very mainstream people say this, that the Bush administration tried to make people think there was a connection without usually ever quite saying so. Because, of course, there was no evidence for it because there was no connection. The only thing Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden had in common was that they were both Arabs and they both had facial hair. That's it. They didn't support the same ideology. Bin Laden was a religious fanatic. Saddam Hussein was a secular, a non-religious, crazy dictator. I don't particularly like either of them, but they didn't have the same ideology. In fact, Saddam Hussein was the kind of guy Bin Laden wanted to get rid of. He would love to have replaced Saddam Hussein with a nice religious man, not some guy going around in army uniforms. He wanted someone who really was a good Muslim. So, and of course, Saddam Hussein knew that. These were not men who liked each other. Okay, so that second implied reason is that 9/11 connection. So WMDs, an implied but inaccurate 9/11 connection. And then there's this third thing. I mentioned this before. There were a lot of guys after the first Iraq War who thought that Bush Sr. made a mistake by not finishing Iraq off. And actually, a lot of these people were Republicans, and they were part of an organization called the Project for a New American Century. And in the 1990s, they pushed again and again for something to be done about Iraq. Here's just one example, a letter in 1998 that they sent to President Clinton, where they said, "We urge you to seize the opportunity to enunciate a new strategy that would secure the interests of the United States and our friends and allies around the world. That strategy should aim above all at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power." So this is back in 1998. They're pushing President Clinton to get rid of Saddam Hussein because they think America would be better off if Iraq had a friendly government. And they wish President Bush, the first guy, President Bush the elder, had done that the first time around. And look at the names here. These are all big names in mostly Republicans, but also some conservative Democrats as well, who want America to be more active in the Middle East. And you look at some of these names end up in the 2001 Bush cabinet. Donald Rumsfeld ends up being Bush's Secretary of Defense. Paul Wolfowitz is his Deputy Secretary of Defense. Richard Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State. John Bolton, who's actually in the news right now, he just wrote a book about Trump, was the United Nations ambassador. So these were not nobodies. These were important guys who end up being in Bush's cabinet. And so these guys have been saying for a long time, we should invade Iraq. And then after 9/11, I think a lot of these guys said, this is our chance. We'll kind of confuse people. We'll talk about a connection to 9/11. And, there are these WMDs, yeah. Did they really believe the WMD stories? I don't know. I honestly don't know. They might have. They might have wanted to believe. I mean, the evidence was very mixed, but maybe they wanted to believe. So, Bush makes these speeches, other guys make speeches, and the United States attacks Iraq in March 2003. Now, by the way, the United States does not get much help. Most of the world, remember that first Iraq war? All these countries help out the United States because they agree Saddam Hussein shouldn't be able to invade Kuwait. The second Iraq war, the world goes, no, I don't get it. Why are you doing this? When the United States attacked Afghanistan, the countries of the world said, okay, we get it. Absolutely. France was very supportive. Nous sommes tous Américains, they said. We are all Americans. But the Iraq War, 2 years later, the French are going, qu'est-ce que c'est? Why are you doing this? Your WMD evidence is weak. There is no 9/11 connection. And this looks like a big mess of a war. So basically, America goes into this war pretty much alone, except for British help. So the British send some guys to help out, which doesn't make the British Prime Minister super popular in his own country. So how does that war go? Well, you saw the mission accomplished picture. The initial invasion goes really well. American troops sweep in. Saddam Hussein's army is not in good shape. It's quickly defeated. Saddam Hussein is eventually captured. But then things go on and on and on, because it's easier to start a war than end a war. And Iraq has a lot of built-in problems. This is one of the reasons why Bush Sr. didn't want to invade in the first place, because you're opening up a giant can of worms. One of the problems is Iraq is basically, as you see in the second map here, Iraq is divided between three main categories of people. In the south here, the sort of the tan color, peach, I guess, are Shia Arabs. So these are Arabs who are believers in Shia Islam. In the center are Sunni Arabs, also Arabs, but Sunni. And there's a long history of friction between Sunni and Shia. Saddam Hussein had been Sunni, so he'd favored the Sunnis. Once he's kicked out, the Sunnis are not happy, and they begin to form guerrilla groups to fight against both the Americans who've come in, but also against the Shia. And the Shia don't love the Americans, but really can't stand the Sunnis, and they form their own militias. And so America is trying to basically play umpire while being shot at for the next, well, 10, 12, 15, it just keeps on going, years. And then things get worse. For the first 6 years or so, from about 2003 to 2009, the United States is trying to build a new government in Iraq. It's trying to work with the various ethnic groups, various tribal groups in Iraq, and while being shot at or trying to stop people from shooting each other. Then starting around 2009, a new group rises to the forefront, which is a group called, well, goes through a series of name changes. Actually, originally, it's called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's actually not really Al-Qaeda. It's sort of like an Al-Qaeda franchise. Some extremist Sunnis in Iraq. And there's a bunch of these groups. There's these various active guerrilla groups in Iraq, different leaders, different agendas, all mostly just shooting at the Americans and sometimes at each other and sometimes at the Shias. But one of these groups connects itself to Al-Qaeda and calls itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. But this group is so extreme that Al-Qaeda says, no, you're too extreme for us. You can't be Al-Qaeda anymore. So they changed their name to the Islamic State. And they spread throughout parts of Iraq, and then they spread into Syria. Now, we'll talk about this more later, but Syria is a mess. So Syria is right next door to Iraq, and Syria, starting in 2011, and this, by the way, is not America's fault. This is a separate thing. But starting in 2011, Syria enters a civil war. Different sides in Syria go to war with each other. This makes Syria a mess. So the Islamic State in Iraq takes this opportunity to invade Syria. And you see this map over here. By 2015, the Islamic State of Iraq has spread into Syria. Now it's calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And as you can see, they take over a nice chunk of territory. So they start in Iraq. And they're basically able to start in Iraq because of the chaos caused by America's invasion creates this opportunity for extremist groups. And then the civil war in Syria, which isn't America's fault, creates another opportunity so they can now expand. So now they're in Iraq and Syria. And there's actually some concern that they're such a successful group, they may take over more and more territory. Now, what are they exactly? They are, in a way, kind of like Al-Qaeda, except even more so. They're hardcore fundamentalist Muslims. They believe in the idea of a society run according to Islamic law, their interpretation of Islamic law, which is very, very strict. And anyone who is not as strict as them is an enemy. And a lot of people find this appealing. Or the Islamic State is able to conquer them and make them find it appealing. This has all sorts of consequences. One of them is that it's a huge mess for Syria. They're both having a civil war between government and anti-government forces, and they're having to fight this Islamic State that's moved in. The result is millions of refugees leave Syria. Some of them eventually finding their way to Europe. So you get this refugee crisis in Europe with hundreds of thousands of refugees going to France, Germany, Norway, Poland, Hungary, which, by the way, also causes an increase of right-wing movements in these countries who become more and more anti-immigrant. So the Syrian civil war and then ISIS moving into Syria causes repercussions in Europe. As far as ISIS goes, ISIS is kind of the one thing everyone in the Middle East can agree on. No one likes ISIS. So groups who don't like each other can sometimes cooperate and fight ISIS. One of the strangest bits of cooperation is Iran and the United States, who still don't like each other, actually sort of work together to beat ISIS. Because as much as the United States doesn't like ISIS, Iran hates ISIS even more. ISIS is a hardcore Sunni extremist groups. They don't like Sunnis who aren't Sunni enough. You can imagine how they feel about Shia. And so when they find Shia shrines, they just blow them up. When they find Shia people, they just kill them. So Iran loathes ISIS and sees it as a dangerous threat. And so the United States, Iran, other countries work to fight against ISIS, and ISIS slowly shrinks. And now ISIS as an organized force is gone. But it's not gone as a group. They no longer own territory. They no longer have like a sort of a country in the middle of the area, but they still have fighters. They still have people who are loyal to them. And so they're still very active around the world. Now, what does this all cost? An immense amount of money. America's two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, cost billions and billions of dollars. They reach a peak in 2008, 2010, that area, but America is still spending money in both places. America is still backing an Iraqi government. America is still backing an Afghan government. Between the two of those, by the way, the Iraqi government is more functional. It works better. The Afghan government, if America leaves, it's not clear if it will survive. The Iraqi government seems like it's likely to survive. That's the good news. The bad news for the United States is that the Iraqi government is only somewhat friendly to America that created it, and is also quite friendly to Iran. Because this brings me to another point, which is it's not all about America. There's other stuff going on. And one of the things going on in the Middle East, it's been going on for a number of years, is there is a rivalry between two major countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran. You see them here on the sort of the relief map, and then here they are. What this map shows over here is what places are more friendly to Iran and what places are more friendly to Saudi Arabia. Now, the obvious big difference between these two countries is religion. Saudi Arabia is the heart of Sunni Islam. Remember, most Muslims are Sunni. And Iran is the heart of Shia Islam. And you can see these little pie charts show you what percentage of the country is of each religion. So Iran is obviously mostly, that dark green is Shia. Iraq is also majority Shia. We also have significant Shia in Syria, significant Shia groups in Lebanon, Shia groups elsewhere as well, including Bahrain, and also down here in Yemen. Because there's that religious difference, and there's also just the fact that they're two big countries who see each other as rivals. And so Saudi Arabia works to get countries on its side, Iran works to get countries on its side, and so Iran basically has Iraq as a kind of a semi-friendly country because Iraq is majority Shia, and so is Iran. Actually, one of the biggest beneficiaries of America's war with Iraq, America got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was this hardcore Sunni who hated Iran, and Iran hated him back. And the government that replaced Saddam Hussein was a Shia majority government. So America got rid of a Sunni dictator and replaced him with a Shia government, which is good for Iran. So basically, the one country the Iraq War really helped was not the United States, it was Iran, the United States' enemy, which was not really America's intention. I've used the term blowback before. This was blowback. This was an unintended consequence. So now Iran has a friendly Iraq. The civil war in Syria, this map here shows ISIS over here, all in sort of the black dashed lines, but this is 2014. Today, 2020, ISIS is basically gone as a major force. And so the Iraq is fully pretty much under the Iraqi government and pro-Iran. Syria is pro-Iran. The government of Syria is pro-Iran. They've won their civil war. Lebanon is pro-Iran. So Iran has this stretch of territory here which is pro-them. And they're also supporting a group down here in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is supporting the other side in Yemen. There's a nasty, nasty war going down here, a civil war between a Shia population in Yemen and a Sunni population in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia is also reasonably tight with Egypt and Jordan, and also the UAE here, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. So Saudi Arabia and Iran, looking across at each other, across the Persian Gulf here, which a huge chunk of the world's oil goes out through this waterway. If Iran and Saudi Arabia ever went to war, it would be a giant mess for the world. Huge mess for the world's economies. So again, this isn't all just about America. America had its own interest. America thought, hey, it'd be great if Iraq was pro-us. But Saudi Arabia and Iran have their own plans and their own rivalry. And America's just, one part of their equation. All right. And terrorism hasn't gone away. Al-Qaeda is still around. Yes, bin Laden was killed, but Al-Qaeda as a group is still around. They're still active in places. The Islamic State, they're gone as a big force in Iraq and Syria, but their activists, people who are loyal to their ideas, are still operating in different places in Africa, in Libya, in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. And then there are other groups as well. Northern Nigeria, the Taliban, Afghanistan. So President Bush, back in 2001, declared a war on terror. The United States was going to be involved in a war on terror. The problem with a war on terror is, when does it end? If you have a war with a country, that may end someday, but when does a war on terror end? And some people have called it the forever war. Now, I showed you guys this before, but I thought you'd just take another look at this chart of who likes who in the Middle East and get a sense of how incredibly crazy it is. ISIS, everyone dislikes. Who does everyone like? Iraq is friendly with a lot of people, but not everyone. Obviously, not ISIS, not Israel, not Saudi Arabia. So, and this is a 2014 chart, but not that much has changed. So the United States is involved in this war on terror in a very complicated place where none of the alliances are clear or easy or simple. Which brings me back to the point again that maybe President Bush the elder was smart to not get involved in such messy situations. Rescue Kuwait and then leave it at that. Don't go and create more trouble. And well, his son did not listen. And so we have this forever war on terrorism. Actually, just as a final note, as I mentioned before, I sometimes play these strange strategy games about these things. Haven't actually played this, but I know it exists. And it's a game called Labyrinth, which is about the war on terror. And what's so sad is they made this game in 2011, but the war on terror kept on going. So they added an additional version of it in 2015, Labyrinth: The Awakening. And then just this year, they've added another version called The Forever War, because the game basically keeps on going. It hasn't stopped. Here are some new cards in the new game. Trump tweets. So now if you play this game, you can play a card which is Trump tweets something, and then seemingly something very random happens. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be crazy. So yeah, when does a war on terror end? When does America not involved in the Middle East? I don't know. We can talk about that in class. Okay. Take care.